I think we are now live streaming. Cool. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Freedom Anarchist News Review. I'm here with Sam, and we've got a few bits and pieces on the news review agenda today. Sam, do you fancy reading them out while I do admin type stuff?
Oh,
They're in the chat as it stands.
yes, thank you. Yeah, so today we are going to be discussing the Barcelona eviction resistance, the train protests in Greece over the crash a couple of years ago, um, anarchism in wartime Ukraine, an article that we had on our website, an interview with an anarchist in Ukraine. We're also possibly going to talk about the appeal hearings from Just Stop Oil, might cover the revival of the Heathrow extension, as well as getting in a bit of talk on reform and how they're now polling ahead of Labour.
So, do we want to start off with the Barcelona mass resistance to eviction at Casa or Sola? Which is was temporarily halted over the weekend after large-scale resistance by housing groups, residents, and local supporters. This obviously in a grand tradition of Spanish housing activism. Yeah, your thoughts on mass resistance?
Well, to be honest, my thoughts on mass resistance is I think mass resistance is a very good tactic when it comes to the state trying to evict people. I think that's a fairly unsurprising opinion from me there. Yeah, as you say, sort of Barcelona and Spain, sort of, and actually, well, Europe in general, there's a lot of quite old squats there, many of them decades old. And so, obviously, they start to become more than just sort of people's homes, although most importantly, that is what they are. But they also become sort of symbols of, what can be, sort of outside of the kind of capitalist sort of system. The alternative kind of housing models and stuff. So obviously, when there's these places do get evicted, it's very emotive for a lot of different reasons, and they, sort of, it's more than just the residents sort of turning out to resist these evictions, and it's always very impressive to see.
Yeah, I mean, obviously Spain, as a general rule, is slightly more impressive than Britain in terms of its organized anarchist presence and its kind of community mobilization. I mean, obviously Britain has its moments. Focus E15 is a very good example of a community organizing setup like that. But I think, I mean, obviously with Britain, we have the lengthy decline of both squatting and housing resistance, which sort of started to pick back up again towards the end of the 2010s, I suppose, with the likes of Living Rent and Acorn, and sort of rent defense organizations, essentially. But I think there's still, in many cases, more of a struggle to unify certainly working class estates to um, consistently stand up against bailiffs and against, particularly gentrification, I think, is something which is considered as kind of just a standard part of British life now. And people are just like, oh, well, eventually we'll be kicked out for some like massive building project to take place. And that's just the way it goes. And legally, we don't have any legs to stand on because we don't own the land and it's criminalized to squat residential areas and all this kind of stuff. But this is, I think with squatted and housing resistance, an awful lot of it is us assuming we can't achieve things because very small scale things often don't. They're much more easily sort of crushed. Whereas larger scale things actually can and do and have historically in Britain been very successful in holding off that kind of process.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think the lack of large scale eviction resistances is that's pretty much in the same vein as how there's just not a lot of mass resistance to a lot of things in this country. We've sort of lost sort of that it's just not kind of really part of the culture anymore. And then I don't know what the laws are like in sort of in Spain and sort of in sort of Europe and stuff as well. But there, on top of that as well, the kind of sort of housing law and sort of renting law and sort of stuff like that is it is a mess and kind of can be quite confusing as well. So there's a big part of kind of getting people to sort of resist these things also includes having to sort of explain the kind of sort of how it works as well. And it just sort of kind of, I think it kind of that it sounds intimidating and people don't want to sort of put themselves out there, but like obviously there's strength in numbers, and that really does need to be kind of got across and encouraged.
Well, it's also, I think ultimately we are now in a position where, there is a Labour government. It's supposedly the left of capital. It's the one that's supposed to be sort of more accepting of um, both protest and the concept of uh, giving the landlords a bit of a kick up the arse once in a while. And they aren't really doing it because obviously Starmer's Labour is not in any way left wing. It's not really interested in that sort of thing. Any reforms it does do are kind of fiddling around the edges. So this is best case scenario because without getting too much onto an upcoming item, um, any other government is going to be worse, right? So what we're looking at, the current situation, the one in which we are still in the middle of a housing crisis, and the only apparent attempt at a solution to this crisis is Labour saying, let's give developers more leeway to do whatever the hell they want, which is like they've had a fair bit of leeway for the last 30 years and have basically built houses which are not suitable for the working classes or the needs of British housing markets and are snapped up by rentier capital and then used to exploit us rather than, for example, being, you know, council housing has many flaws in and of itself, but still is more protected in many ways than private housing would be, let alone building and maintaining and supporting cooperative housing, where you have more of a say over your own life and over your own home. Um, in the absence of all of these things, there needs to be an extra parliamentary movement to bring those ideas forward, to protest for them, to cause disruption for them. Um, and, like, I think there is a strong element where protest has been made to seem alienated from working class struggle as a general concept. So when you talk about protests now, it's what? It's
Middle class
rioting in
people,
rioting in
lefty.
Stockport. It's middle class people protesting over things which don't affect most working class people a lot of the time, um, or the things which aren't core to what most working class people think of as their causes. Um, or it's stuff like JSO, which again we'll get onto a little bit later, where it's like even though it is stuff which is going to impact the working class primarily, it's done in a way which is often completely alien to people's understanding of the world and how they feel that they should be fitting into it. So, so yeah, like the reconnecting of protest and the meaning of protest and the importance of protest, and indeed the ability of protest to win. By protest, I don't just mean A to B marches, I mean direct action and I mean disruption. Is something which the broad left is not going to do it. They keep wanging around talking about what to do now and how to forestall the rise of reform. But all of their solutions are we should set up a new party or we should take over the Greens or um,
Yeah.
but yeah, there's those aren't solutions. Those aren't shifting, the famous Overton window of what people consider acceptable politics and uh, achievable politics. And I don't see a way in which they would become so either. Um,
No. No.
anyway, that was a hefty rant. I will try not to do too many of those. Um, So moving on from mass eviction resistance, we've got the Greece train crash protests. And I don't know whether you've got that article up or I can
I
read out the.
I've not put it up, but
Uh, so the basic article is um, the Tempe disaster, which was a train crash in February 2023 in Greece, has seen hundreds of thousands of anti-government protesters flood the streets because they feel that the investigation into the crash is a cover-up for infrastructure neglect. Um,
yeah,
Sam,
which
do you want to give your views on infrastructure neglect by the state?
well, as I was going to say, it's sort of sounds like infrastructure the infrastructure neglect because it kind of is, you know. Once again, shocking. But I mean, this isn't, keeping it on the sort of subject of Greece, of course, it is, this is been a big problem in Greece for a very long time, and corruption is a big problem everywhere. But sort of once, this is a kind of the continuation of quite a lot of sort of similar things. Obviously this in particular, once again, sort of lots of people died, so it's kind of a big one. But like this problem has been a big issue, and this isn't the only protest of this sort. And it's just once again it's a very it's good to see a lot of people out and sort of actually kind of kind of trying to sort of take the government to task for this sort of thing. It's kind of once again kind of hard to like to think that you'd see a similar sort of thing if it happened over here, but I don't.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, obviously, in Greece itself, you've got New Democracy has been in charge for the last while, following the comprehensive victory of the IMF and Germany leading Europe in their gutting of the Greek welfare state and most of the public services, and indeed most of the oversight groupings that might have prevented something like this from happening. Um, and the victory, that victory, which obviously killed Syriza stone dead, largely because the general public voted in a referendum to back Syriza in taking on Europe, and then Syriza basically went, actually, we're not going to do that. Just going to kind of fold, and leading directly to the rise of New Democracy and largely the collapse of the um, rebellious left movement, which had been characterizing most of the 2010s. And this essentially is a notable consequence, along with many other aspects of Greek life today. I was reading a fascinating little piece in the FT. This is a slight tangent. The other day, in which there's a particularly irritating columnist who was insisting that the PIGS group of Southern European economies, so Portugal, Italy, Greece, Spain, um, which for a long time were considered the basket cases of Europe and in need of serious structural reform, and was saying that they are now growing apace. And this is an example of how the same basic reforms need to be applied to the whole of Europe. So, Europe needs to cut way back on its public sector expenditure. It needs to abandon many of the welfare aspects of its society. It needs to cut back on job security. It needs to essentially reform to be more like the US in that sense. And is saying, look at the economic growth of these countries post economic reform. Look how well they're doing. And it's like, well, okay, but what actually happened there was Greece lost like 30% of its economy in the course of a few years, had mass unemployment, still has um, very high unemployment. The its ability to buy stuff, its populace to actually afford things, declined dramatically over that period. Um, and all of its services were decimated. And that's why the economy is now rising apace. Because if you go like that, and then that, then yeah, like number goes up in latter years, right? Um, but that doesn't mean that the services in Greece and the safety features of public services in Greece have not been torched and with predictable results. Um,
Not. I'm gonna be honest. I don't know a lot about Greece, so
well, uh, I've sort of read enough to go on another little rant. Um, but yeah, I mean, like the Greek economic experiment is, I think, a fascinating one to read through because obviously Syriza was a fantastic example of an attempt to, through radical parliamentary means, uh, change the direction of a major economy, relatively major economy. Um, and they were just completely unable to do so. They just didn't have the leverage. And essentially, the anarchist analysis, and actually, to be fair to most Marxists, I think they would have a similar analysis, where you can't just take a modern economy, anything much under the size of maybe the US and China, and attempt to buck the markets and just not expect a dramatic disciplinary action to be taken by those markets, which will force you to reverse course. And Yanis Varoufakis with Syriza came up infamously with a strategy to attempt this process, which just didn't happen. I mean, his view is Syriza could have and bottled it. I think that's an optimistic take on what the situation actually was. Um,
well, yes. I mean, of course, yeah. If parliamentary democracy was the way forward, we wouldn't be anarchists.
well, quite. I mean, we do. I don't want to say we're always right because that's absolutely not the case. But like, we do get it right quite often. Like,
Well, I would say quite a lot. Yeah,
yeah.
just
Okay.
a matter of getting other people to see that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, on which note, we can probably move on again to one where right or wrong is one which freedom could fall on one side or the other, actually, in terms of how it's presented things, and has been told off on essentially both sides of this coin um, over
Uh,
time. And this is an article which we've had, which is essentially about solidarity collectives and anarchists in the Ukraine and during the war. Um, and for folks who don't watch this very often, freedom is, we don't have an official position on it. Particularly in the news group, we tend to uh, view ourselves more as a platform rather than saying we have a specific editorial policy. But generally speaking, freedom has tended to platform groups which are more solidaristic towards Ukrainian struggle and specifically towards anarchists in the Ukraine who are in struggle against the invasion. And we have been criticised, and I think some of those criticisms are probably going to turn out to be good ones, and some of them are not, over that position, generally from the no war but the class war position. Um, but in the article, essentially, uh, Kusha, maybe, I'm not sure how you would pronounce it, writes about at the anti-authoritarian volunteers, fundraising that's gone on for them through Operation Solidarity, later reorganized as the Solidarity Collectives, which is a mutual aid network which supports between 80 to 100 anarchist and anti-fascist organizers and fighters within the Ukrainian army and around the struggle in Ukraine, essentially. And we've had plenty of conversations about this. So again, I'll give you a space to have a say.
yeah, I mean, this is quite an easy article to sort of see where the kind of controversy would fit in, because, as you say, you know, we tend to sort of take a, you know, kind of a more I guess nuanced stance, which inevitably nuance generally kind of upsets everyone over strong especially when it's a sort of strong and highly emotive issue. Not to sort of downplay either side of that, but anarchism has generally sort of presented itself, regardless of where you stand on the sort of pacifist, sort of non-violence or, sort of opposing that sort of thing. Anarchism generally has been anti-militarist, and that's a very easy position to sort of hold when you're not in a country that is kind of under invasion from a hostile, imperialist power. And there's like, this is an argument that has just, the last since the invasion has been fairly kind of constant. And the kind of question is, at what line does sort of solidarity become support of the state? And that, honestly is a quite a difficult question. It was an interesting article. I've been following this, sort of what's been going on in Ukraine since 2014, and there's never been a point when it's not been complicated. But I think sort of the thing that most people should kind of probably be behind is the sort of more solidarity sort of side of kind of providing like medical support and sort of refugee support and sort of stuff like that. Obviously, the kind of more controversial aspect would be the kind of the drone making, because you're kind of actively contributing to something that does have the power to take human life. And I'm that's something which should everyone should kind of consider and sort of be thought about and talked about. And kind of it can be, these arguments can be very frustrating to have, sort of depending on, for both people on both sort of sides of it and stuff like that. But I do think it's very healthy that these arguments are happening. It does show that, like, sort of everyone is taking the issue seriously. And it's complicated.
Yeah. Quick shout out to Marianne. Hi, Marianne, who is a good comrade of freedom. So I think so. So as a general sort of, I had an interesting chat on Blue Sky actually with a comrade who was sort of saying that the whole anarcho drone brigades is a bit, feels a bit like a kind of over enthusiasm for the concept of capitalist wars or inter-imperialist wars, and I absolutely get that tendency and how that feels, particularly because I think that a lot of the time the tone of debate, particularly cliche, but on social media, tends towards the my way or you're a complete scumbag approach, where sort of people who take the no war but the class war position are sort of presented with a kind of response that just says, "Oh well, screw you. You just love Putin the fascist," and then they kind of get into a counter argument of, "Oh well, you're in favor of the Ukrainians who are also fascists." It's like, well, there's actually a lot of space in between those two positions, and also like a thing where I think no war but the class war is presented as the consistent position of anarchism, whereas actually, historically it's been anything but. Like, anarchists have been arguing over everything from the Boer War to the Egyptian War, to World War II in particular. Anarchists were kind of mostly on board with the Spanish Civil War, rather less so when it came to the Troubles and supporting liberation struggle in the North of Ireland. Like, and with Gaza, of course, where I think you would struggle to find any anarchists who are not in favor of the struggle of Palestinians, but also in a straightforward way, it is a struggle which is led by Hamas, which is an organization I don't think any of us would probably be wildly in favor of. And yeah, these there is a problem, I think, of we know what the ideal position is for anarchism at all times, which is the class struggle is the one which actually matters, right? Like none of us give a rat's ass about um, whether Zelensky comes out on top of this particular war, um, or whether Putin is happy or not. The thing which actually matters is what happens to the working classes on both sides of the border, not just Ukraine, but in Russia as well, right?
Absolutely.
But
I mean, I
exactly
think
how we achieve that ideal is the difficulty.
yeah, and I think that's the kind of key part of that is like we are anarchists are we are with the people, and that's should be the kind of focus of what we're doing, and you know kind of getting bogged down into over sort of when that become when sort of support for a people becomes support for a nation, and whether or not that's nationalism. So these are important arguments to be had, but like a lot it does feel a lot of the time that this is those arguments are being kind of deployed to avoid the subject of solidarity, which it shouldn't. I think like I said, the drone, making drones and sort of stuff like that. Kind of, I can see where that would be more kind of complicated, but like I do find sort of the idea that sort of that supporting refugees from the from pushed out of Ukrainian cities by the Russian invasion, or kind of injured people kind of resisting that, the idea that kind of sort of supporting them through housing and sort of sort of being medics and sort of stuff like that is somehow supported of nationalism, kind of that removes a very kind of like human aspect of the sort of need to do solidarity, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay, so on the subject of solidarity, and one which is a lot easier going, is the JSO appeal hearing. So, for folks who don't know, although most of you probably do, if you're watching this, the JSO 16 are a group. Well, they're actually four separate groupings technically, or four separate cases, which were held or heard largely over the course of last year, and they were related to a number of different actions undertaken by JSO groupings, most famously the M25 blockade. And the sentencing for these groups was, I mean, I think fair to say, absurdly high in comparison to, certainly in comparison to previous sentencings. In a couple of cases, you're talking 4 or 5 years, and took absolutely no account of the conscientious angle of what those protests represented, which is one of the things that the lawyers were arguing, which was saying actually under basic human rights law, international human rights law, these are actions which were undertaken essentially to try and prevent a greater crime, and were undertaken in good faith and conscientious faith, rather than being, random acts of vandalism or sabotage or whatever. Um, Yeah. What are your views on, I suppose, it's the way that the state has been approaching these court cases and these sentences and the wider implications, essentially?
Yeah, like so correct me if I'm wrong here, but the conditions under which these sort of sort of place, there was sort of some quite uh absurd sort of elements to it. So were these the cases where in one instance the judge basically forbade the defense from mentioning climate change
Yep.
and sort of and stuff like that? Now, this that I still I can't work out whether or not there's like actually kind of precedent for that, but that elements like that I think kind of really kind of present the kind of extreme kind of lengths that the state has kind of gone to sort of to do this, and it's just that seems very odd to me. I mean, the justice system is anything but just, and sort of never has been, never will be. That is, and that's once again a very kind of core part of sort of like our anarchist understanding of bourgeois justice is, sort of bourgeois justice is no justice, and you shouldn't expect to find it justice there. But even by our very low standards of what to expect from the British justice system, so called, these cases have been pretty shocking, and I once again, like, we sort of stand for the abolition of all kind of carceral sort of justice and sort of stuff like that. But like, you look at the sort of compare it to the sentencing of, sort of people in the kind of riots and stuff like that. You saw much lower sentencing for, arguably much more extreme, kind of crimes, and it's one of those things where it kind of feels like the justice system is making a mockery of itself. And
Yeah, it shows up particularly in comparison to the farming protests. So you've got, farmers driving their tractors down the M25, blockading in very similar ways, albeit with much larger machinery, various key roads, and not being arrested, let alone sent down for 4 to 5 years, right? And I've seen sort of various people will tend to jabber on particularly on social media from the right, saying, well, they're very different circumstances, and one of them has a real point to make. And it's like they both have real points to make. It's more to the point that the justice system is very blatantly not doing the one thing it's supposed to do in theory, which is be consistent. Um, and
yes, and all equal under the law, I thought.
and yeah, and that kind of targeted injustice, essentially, um, it should be something that worries liberals. Like as you say, us, we kind of expect this kind of thing. Like you see it happen intermittently, particularly whenever the king or the queen, as was doing anything down the mall. If Republic wanted to show up, or what was it, ma'am, something against monarchy. Um, it was a radical anti-monarchy book group back in the 90s and 2000s. Whenever they wanted to do protests or hold up placards mocking the monarchy, they would get preemptively arrested and dragged away for a few hours. And it was like that was just a thing that happens in Britain, where protesting the monarch is illegal, even though they say it isn't. Um, and this kind of creep against protest, against the assumed legality of protest. Um, the more often they are allowed to do it and get away with it, the more often they will. And that's I think where again extra parliamentary activity is really important. Where that pressure needs to be put on, not because we think the state is fair or going to behave as though it is, but because if you don't push back, then they would keep extending it in the knowledge that they can keep getting away with it until eventually liberals will also be getting arrested. In fact, Republic is a pretty liberal organization and does get arrested. Chris Packham and Chris Nineham and the whole Stop the Warlock getting arrested. They weren't really doing anything wrong. They lost your face there. They were just a
Yeah,
book.
I've got to plug in my charger. My laptop's flashing.
Fair. Um, yeah, it's liberals become the target if they don't stop radicals from being the target, essentially. I suppose is
Yes.
the argument there. Um, which leads us sort of onto the revival of Heathrow and Rosebank, two projects which were repeatedly targeted for green direct action, and in fact were successfully broken by a combination of direct action and legal challenges, and the whole gamut of stuff, which was essentially pointing to the many flaws in both projects. And yet, somehow, we are back here again with Rachel Reeves. I'm not saying she's out of ideas, but she seems to have found a big box in Whitehall marked crap ideas that were dropped for good reason, and it's having a good old rummage around, dragging them all out. Um, and thus we have the third runway at Heathrow, which was killed in 2020, and Rosebank, the oil extraction project, which was killed, I think, in 2023, both for the very good reason that they do not in any way mesh with the Paris Climate Accords.
Yeah, it kind of feels like we're kind of in line for to sort of pull out fracking as an option next week.
I would not be in the least bit surprised. Yeah, there's a definite trend here of Rachel Reeves needing any headline which says we can produce growth, even though Heathrow, for example, would take 10 to 20 years to come online, by which time Rachel Reeves' uh, career, I suspect, will have been well and truly laid to rest. Um,
Yeah, I mean, it's you know it it feels a bit kind of simplistic in a way, but one of the things I've always sort of fought back upon is that kind of quite, in my mind, lazy kind of anarchist slogan that all political parties are exactly the same, all politicians are exactly the same,
yeah.
nothing different between them. And I've always pushed back on that and sort of argued for the fact that that's a quite a simplistic understanding, and in fact, it's important to sort of appreciate and understand that actually not all parties are the same and not all politicians are the same. And then stuff like this happens where they're just sort of taking each other's ideas. The left wing party is now in power and doing exactly the same thing that the Tories were doing. And, trying, it kind of feels that they're kind of embarrassing me a bit by,
I mean, I think you've got. I can think of at least a couple of examples which continue to show that you have a point. Most notably the US uh, at the moment, but also like the rise of reform is going to, I suspect, in fairly short order, showcase this as well. But you know, New Labour, sorry, not New Labour, New Labour, Starmerite Labour, is essentially a an example of the other side of things, where in the absence of a pseudo, um, or not even pseudo, a usurpation from the right, the tendency will be, particularly in British politics, but also we've seen in US politics and politics generally in Europe, is that because the left has been largely ousted from core party political participation, the centre has, and we're seeing it fail to hold, right? But Starmerite Labour is an attempt to hold the centre, and the centre is that identicalist model, where you've got the Tories and Labour both agree on about 95% of their policy making, and there's about 5% which is based around how much they hate trans people, um, or are prepared to waffle on about culture wars. Uh, and the rest of it is, yeah, or you with occasional asides of Liz Truss trying something and then getting told nah by the markets. Um, but yeah, like the party politics is characterized by it's all the same until it isn't, I suppose, right? Um,
there's definitely something to be said for, I mean, the idea that sort of party politics is kind of essentially is it's very de-radicalizing for a start, regardless of left or right, it kind of draws in the center is an argument that could be kind of made. But from the kind of Labour perspective, it's kind of quite interesting to sort of see that this is very much the sort of case with them sort of taking this sort of shift to the right in order to get into sort of power. And now they seem to basically be kind of falling into the same trap that the Tories were falling into about sort of like trying to, it's no longer kind of the Conservatives versus Reform. It's almost like the Labour versus Reform, and they're going, are they going to start sort of, are we going to sort of start seeing, Rachel Reeves going down the sort of path of Suella Braverman and,
wouldn't surprise me in the least.
Priti Patel and sort of
I mean,
making
in fact,
increasingly
they
extreme
already
colour?
are. I mean, one of the things which we have noticed, for example, is that um, Keir Starmer's made a great a big deal of going to Georgia Maloney to look at her um, hilariously ineffective attempts to change migration policy in Italy. I think there's been three attempts now at working out a deportation methodology which fits with European law and with human rights law, and it just keeps not working. Nevertheless, he went over there to learn the lessons from her. Um,
The thing which is particularly
and
impressive in this case is the fact that this is like, we're sort of seeing the same thing happening again and again and again, and each time it seems to be happening quicker.
yeah, and this is fundamentally an aspect of the British public is not working off an analysis of party politics, which is structural. Because what we can say as people who, work through certainly an anarchist and often a Marxist lens or a semi-Marxist lens, is that large aspects of this, you're just like, of course, this is how it functions. Of course, parties get into government and realize, oh, actually, the last party was working under a set of constraints, and I have to function under those constraints as well. Otherwise, the economy is going to do something crazy. And actually, it's going to cause a huge amount of hugely destructive fallout, which I can't afford to do as a politician. And it's the whole can't turn a tank around very quickly thing, right? Is that there's a certain amount of inertia in politics, which it doesn't matter how radical you are or want to be, actually you will be disciplined by the realities of being in government. And actually we see this with Trump as well. Like, Trump's radicalism or Trump's attempted radicalism, it's a large percentage of it is rhetorical. It's not borne out by what he's actually going to be able to do, physically do. Like, he starts off with, I'm going to put tariffs on everybody. But the tariffs on Canada and Mexico last less than 24 hours and are over actually relatively minor bits of bullying that he reckoned he could get away with. It wasn't a wholesale America takes on the world trade war because Trump's looking at the same numbers as everyone else is. Like he wants to be an isolationist, but he can't immediately shut all the borders. Like if you wanted to do a really radical isolationist policy, he could shut every port tomorrow. He could send the army in and say, no more goods from China. He's not going to do it. He's not going to stop raw materials coming in from Canada. He's not going to stop food coming in from Mexico. He's not going to stop, high quality goods from Japan and Korea and Europe. Like he doesn't want that, so he's not going to do it. It's going to be a lot of, fluff and spectacle and shouting and aggressiveness, but it's not going to be tear it all down because he's not about that. He's a billionaire, and everybody in his cabinet are billionaires. They want more, but they don't want to destroy everything. They're not tear it all down merchants.
And sort of bring it back. I mean, this is, I mean, I think there's definitely a kind of quite a lot of, throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing kind of, sort of which strands stick, kind of going on both, well, everywhere, like, sort of here and there. And I think like this, it does feel like we're kind of, it's that, the crisis of the kind of neoliberal order is, it's that, see, it doesn't look like we are sort of seeing this all kind of come apart a bit, and the sort of struggle to sort of try and keep it going. And I think I mean, Heathrow is just, is a very, good example of that. It's that, this sort of fight for kind of this, sort of capitalist globalism and sort of the need to sort of have, sort of bring this all in, and it's just not working. And it's going to be interesting to see where that goes.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, what we're seeing now is a much delayed, actually, fallout from the crisis of neoliberalism, which happened in 2008. And then they managed to stumble on for another, uh, well, another 17 years odd? Let's say 15 years, 15, 16 years. They managed to stumble on with variations on the theme, with a declining ability of the center to hold off the second, essentially the attempt to stabilize that crisis by reintroducing um, social ultra-conservatism, elements of protectionism between individual state actors, and the international classes' desire to essentially become post-state entities. And you sort of see this with Musk and the tech bros in particular recently, is that they've taken on the mantle of running the US government, but they're primarily doing it so that they don't have to be beholden to the US government. Um, and all of these are symptoms of the same crisis, right? Like neoliberalism is unable to provide uh, any of the things which the general public need. It can't solve the general problem of if you continue to move wealth and power and assets up with you eventually end up so lopsided that it's unsustainable, etc., etc. I mean, we know all this. Um, but which leads us on to the we barely talked about Heathrow and Rosebank there. That was all about neoliberal crisis. But it does lead us on to the last topic, and I am aware that we're 45 minutes in, so we'll try and get this done by the hour. Um, Leads us on to reform polling ahead of Labour, a perfect example of the very crisis that we have been talking about.
Yeah, it's God, it's I mean it's all connected, isn't it? Like, and it's such a I genuinely can't work out what's kind of going on in you know Parliament in the Labour Party and all of that. Like, there's got to be people sort of saying, this is all kind of going wrong, and we need to sort of change course a bit, and they're not, and it's just compounding the problem, and you know a reform really actually sort of doing all that much other than just sort of not being the party in power, because it kind of feels like that's basically their main selling point at this point, is
Yeah.
just not being the main party in power because they're the ones who are messing everything up.
I mean, if you look at on the face of it, Reform have been doing very badly recently because Nigel Farage showed his ass comprehensively around the whole Elon Musk, Tommy Robinson supporting British imprisoned neo-Nazis farrago, right? Um, like Farage annoyed large elements of the far right by being equivocal on it. Um, and Reform itself, it's got a lot of vibrancy in the sense that um, it's the insurgent party, right? In the same way as MAGA was the insurgent element within um, the Republican Party, in the same way as Alternative for Deutschland is the insurgent presence in Germany and National Rally is in France, right? Like they are the ones who the ruling class clearly are not terribly enthusiastic about having in power. Um, and therefore they are the go-to ones for people who want to vote against the people in power. Like I think there is definitely elements of the same phenomenon as Brexit, where people vote for them because the media don't want them to, or elements of the media that they don't like don't want them to. I think that there's a load of people who are slightly behind in terms of that because Reform actually has a powerful media support base now, which is, I would argue, more advanced certainly than the Tories have got. Like the Tories have got what? The Times. I think they've lost control of the Telegraph to a great degree because the Telegraph is sort of vacillating between whether it likes GB News or whether it likes the Tories. Um, and maybe the Daily Mail, although again, the Daily Mail I think likes to hedge its bets. But it's way ahead in things like social media. And also in terms of its ground game. Like ground game is overstated these days, I think, but only in the sense that when people talk about ground game, tend to think about door knocking, and handing out leaflets and doing stalls in town centres, which is it's got its place in the same way as, and I'm a print guy. I love my printed papers and journals, all the rest of it. But like it's it's limited. It's good for handing out and getting to people who otherwise wouldn't see it. But also the internet is where it's at, right? Like people reform have taken over, or reform and reformish people have taken over broad swathes of Facebook, Twitter, they're on Truth Social. You know, they have a huge social media presence and go often largely unchallenged and are very good at creating the kinds of echo chambers which reinforce and draw people in to those ecosystems. Much, much better. Like the Tories don't have it, Labour don't have it.
I mean, this, I think this kind of very much, reform very much kind of come out of that, far right, sort of area, can argue about exactly kind of where on that line they sort of fall, but the advantage that they've got over pretty much everyone else is the ability to sort of utilize lies, mistruths, and sort of do that. They have absolutely no need or care to deal with the sort of truth. Their game is to get into power, and if they have to come to lie to sort of do that, then that's all we need to do. And this is very difficult to sort of counter, and once again sort of the less so the kind of conservative, but sort of the more liberal progressive Labour Party, Green Party, sort of the Guardian, the Independent, sort of very these sort of things, they're still very much playing a game where the truth will out. If we sort of tell people that these people are lying and show the people that they are lying, that's how we counter them. We counter their lies with our truth, and the truth will always win. Except it doesn't. History has shown that the truth doesn't always doesn't win.
And actually,
These
calling
people
people
lie and can.
liars doesn't predispose them to like you. This is the like if someone says something ludicrous to you, um, like uh, 15 million migrants came in last year, and if that happens for the next 3 years, we'll be in a minority. Like those kinds of lines, right? Like if you then say to them, "Oh, you're an idiot! God, you bloody idiot! Can't believe you believe that, you idiot!" Like their reaction is not going to be, "Oh God, yes, no, you're right. I am an idiot." Right? They're going to double down on it because that's how people work. Um,
Exactly. And this is something that, is, you know, once again, the Labour Party struggling with it, but like everyone's struggling with it. Like even, we even like us on the more kind of radical left are, this is something that,
And it's hard not to. It is hard not to. I would not for a moment suggest that I have not gotten into an argument on social media and been like, you idiot. I can't believe that you think that. Because sometimes you're just like, what? But
but it,
it's a bad tendency and it is a self-defeating tendency. Like I see this, like as an anarchist, I see this coming from liberals in the US directly after the election, right? So there has been a complete meltdown that's happened in the liberal wing of the Democrat Party. So not so much on the left, but on the liberal wing of the Democrat Party, where they lost to Trump and they can't believe it. They can't believe that that didn't vote against the ludicrous orange-faced freak show fascist, right? And I understand that. I understand that it is outlandish and weird. And how can anybody look at that guy and not think this person should not be in charge of a fucking shoe shop, let alone an entire. I mean, not to say bad things about shoe shop owners, um, but but their reaction to it is to say everyone who didn't vote is an idiot. And I'm just sat there being like, you were unable to persuade them to vote against Trump. That's where the failure
well,
lies.
it's not even.
It's not to do with them not voting. It's to do with your offer being so bad that they can't be bothered to vote for it because you were relying on there is no alternative and telling people they were idiots if they weren't going to vote for the Democrats.
And it's kind of, and this is the this is very much part of the problem is the fact that because we do you see it's not just the Democrats in the states doing this as well. Labour sort of also sort of follows that sort of similar sort of line, and this is something that we very much sort of see, and this is why we're seeing the kind of collapse of these like supposedly left wing, left centre kind of parties and people aren't sort of supporting them is because, they're both at the same time telling people who believe, who vote for the, autocratic, sort of fascists and, sort of people who are telling blatantly stupid lies about, you know, as you say, sort of 15 million people coming in every week, and people are buying that. They're sort of saying these people are idiots. They're, sort of, they're repugnant. They're, basket cases. They're sort of saying all this, but then at the same time, they're trying to sort of mirror the, the sort of, a kind of, or kind of come up with a more palatable version of, these, the rate of the racism. Let's just sort of call it what it is. Like, sort of, we can, this person, you are crazy and insane for believing this person's lies, but also we can do what they want to do, but more effectively. And
Yeah,
that comes across as, inconsistent and, sort of dishonest because it is. There's no, they don't actually, well, maybe some of them do, a lot of them don't. They're just saying it because they want to win those votes, and people can see that, and sort of, and on top of that as well, I mean, there's this, what was it? There's the Guardian. There was an article about a year and a half ago, I think, came out. It was about I was reading it recently, and it was a study which sort of showed that centre left and social democratic parties that take on right wing policies in order to attract voters don't end up doing any better. In fact, they end up doing worse because the right wing voters they're trying to appeal to, they don't care. They're not going to support that party. They're happy that party is now being more racist, but they're never going to vote for it because, why vote for the people who are pretending to be racist when I can vote for the real racists?
yeah,
And the people who are already in the party end up leaving the party because their party has abandoned its core values. And so sort of taking on those sort of things. That seems like a very obvious sort of thing. Even before I read this article, this is something that I've been saying for, years, that this is, surely this is what's going on here. And this is kind of part of the problem that Labour is very much sort of falling into that exact trap. And they're just it's frustrating to see. I am no supporter of parliamentary democracy, but it is very frustrating to have these critiques, have the problems be so obvious, and to sit there and just be kind of like, you idiots.
yeah. It is. It's a thing where I don't give a flying wassit about the Labour Party as an organisation. But it is also the case that like all of the things they're doing wrong are things which empower and enable the likes of reform and the people behind reform and build a support base for them. So Labour's ineptitude is directly impacting on projects which I actually want to succeed, like anti-fascism and a defeat of thinking around, racist thinking around migration and the sort of the anti-woke um, sort of campaigning, which has led to trans people and LGBTQ people as a whole coming under more and more pressure, and the eventual gutting of you know, even the weak methodology of DEI and all the rest of it. Like these failures of imagination and of political nous um, are they have wider effects um, on the body politic, I suppose. All right, on which chirpy note we have near enough hit our hour. So we have two things probably to announce, or at least two things. There is obviously, as Sam is so glamorously demonstrating, a new book which is coming out on February the 13th, with a launch talk at Freedom Press, which people are more than welcome to come along to, 7 p.m. on the 13th. Which will feature Louise Perbrick, who is the writer of the additional chapters of Physical Resistance, which bring it up to date, as well as having edited a lot of the original text to sort of tidy it all up. Sam, do you want to, as you were one of the people who was most involved with sorting it all out, do you want to do a quick précis of the book?
Yeah, so it's basically a a history of British anti-fascism. It's starting obviously in the kind of early 1900s, or the birth of sort of fascism, and the new chapter brings it all the way up to 2018, 2019. So it kind of quite literally covers 100 years of British anti-fascism. It's a kind of trying to sort of come from the tradition of the more kind of anarchistic sort of tradition of an oral kind of history written down. So it's very much focusing as far as possible on the experiences of people who are on the ground, but not the leadership. So it's sort of loads of interviews with sort of just sort of rank and file members of various organizations, as well as sort of just everyday people who turned out and were involved in everything from kind of Cable Street to the anti-national action demos in Liverpool, protests against EDL, obviously. This one in the newer chapters. I would say it's a very good book. I read the original one, and was sort of pushed for this one to be republished through Freedom. And once again, the new chapter is very good, very interesting. I was sort of around for some of the events that sort of took place, and it's does a very good job of getting across the sort of situation the left was in, dealing with the various groups. It's a very good book. I recommend it highly.
So if you were active in the 2010s in particular, in anti-fascism, you might, and you ran enough demos, you might well see one of yours mentioned. And then the final thing to announce, this is the last Tuesday version of this that we're going to be doing. However, we will, as of next week, be switching to Wednesdays. This will hopefully mean that a few of our other comrades will be available to do talking rather than just my ugly mug, and occasionally Sam's and Uri's as well. You're a very handsome guy. I've only calling myself an ugly mug. So keep an eye out for us on Wednesdays from next week onwards. Have a great week, and
Very
see you
much.
again soon. Bye.